The notification came at 11:15 on a Sunday night. Lucas was lying on his bed, back propped against two pillows he'd stacked against the headboard, the room dark except for the white glow of his phone screen. He'd been in this position for nearly 2 hours, cycling through the same 3 apps. A brokerage platform he'd downloaded 6 weeks ago but never actually used. A YouTube channel where a guy in his early 30s explained compound interest with colored charts, and a Reddit thread titled, "I'm 24 and have $3,000 saved. What do I do?" The thread had 847 comments. Lucas had read most of them. The notification was from the brokerage app, a stock he'd been watching for 2 weeks. A mid-sized tech company that had been climbing steadily, had just dropped 4.3% in after-hours trading. Somewhere in the comments of a forum he'd found at 10 p.m., someone had said this was a buying opportunity. Someone else had agreed enthusiastically. A third person had posted a screenshot of their own gains from buying a similar dip 3 months ago. Lucas stared at the number. 4.3%. His finger hovered over the screen. He thought about the $2,800 he'd saved over the past 8 months. He thought about his coworker Daniel, who was 26, and had casually mentioned last Thursday, over bad coffee in the break room, that he'd made a decent return on some stocks over the past year. Daniel hadn't elaborated, Lucas hadn't asked. But the comment had lodged itself somewhere in the back of his mind and stayed there, quietly growing, until it became the reason he was awake at nearly midnight on a Sunday, reading strangers' opinions about a company he'd looked up for the first time 40 minutes ago. He pressed the buy button. Not everything. He wasn't reckless, or so he told himself. Just $900. Just a third of what he had. Just enough to feel like he was participating in something. He confirmed the transaction. The app showed a small animation of a rising arrow. Lucas set the phone face down on his chest, stared at the ceiling, and waited to feel like an investor. He'd grown up in a house where money was never discussed at the dinner table, but its absence was always felt. His father, Renato, had worked in logistics for most of Lucas's childhood. Steady work, dependable schedule, a salary that covered the bills with enough left over for small comforts. They weren't poor, but they weren't comfortable either. They lived in a permanent state of approximate sufficiency, where unexpected expenses, a car repair, a medical bill, a broken appliance, weren't disasters, but were treated with the gravity of near disasters. The family recalibrated. Meals got simpler. Vacations got postponed. Things got handled, but not easily, and not without stress. What Lucas remembered most wasn't the stress itself, but the silence around it. His parents didn't fight about money. They simply went quiet. His mother would get a certain stillness about her when she sat at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes. His father would start working extra shifts without announcement, and come home later and eat alone in the kitchen after everyone else was in bed. Money trouble in his house was something you endured privately. It wasn't a conversation. It was a weight you carried alone and didn't name out loud. Lucas had carried that silence into adulthood. At 24, he had a decent job. He worked in customer support for a software company, remote 3 days a week. And he was making more than his father had at the same age. He knew this because his father had told him once, with a kind of quiet pride that Lucas hadn't known how to respond to. He'd smiled and nodded and changed the subject. He had $2,800 in a savings account, now on $900 after the Sunday night purchase, and a vague but persistent anxiety about the future. Not panic. Just a low hum of worry that intensified every time a coworker mentioned a stock, or a targeted ad appeared on his phone for an investment app, or he read a headline about inflation eroding purchasing power. He felt behind. Not dramatically behind, not catastrophically behind, but quietly, persistently, frustratingly behind. The way you feel when you're walking and you notice everyone around you seems to be moving slightly faster, without appearing to try. He wanted to fix that feeling. He just didn't know how. By Tuesday, the stock had dropped another 2.1%. Lucas checked it 11 times between waking up and noon. He'd told himself he wouldn't obsess, and then he had obsessed, and now he was sitting in front of his work laptop with a brokerage tab open in the background, while he half-processed customer tickets. The rational part of his brain knew that 2 days was not a meaningful time frame. The irrational part, the part that had made the purchase at midnight based on a Reddit comment, kept doing math. Down 6.4% combined. On $900, that was roughly $57.60. Not catastrophic, but not nothing either. $57 was a week of groceries. It was 4 tanks of gas. It was the difference between this month feeling okay and this month feeling tight. He called his father that evening, not to talk about the stock, he hadn't planned to mention it, but because he'd been meaning to call all week and the guilt of not calling had finally accumulated past the threshold of inertia. Renato picked up on the second ring. They talked about small things for a while. Lucas's mother was visiting his aunt for a few days. The neighbor had finally fixed the fence. His father had been watching a documentary series about Formula One that he'd become unexpectedly invested in. Then, in a pause between topics, Lucas said it. "I bought a stock on Sunday, impulsively, late at night. It's already down." His father was quiet for a moment. "How much did you put in?" "900. Another pause. Not judgmental. Just processing. "Tell me exactly how it happened, how you found it, how you decided, what time it was." So Lucas told him. The apps, the forums, the after-hours drop, the comment about the buying opportunity, Daniel from work and his vague mention of returns, the notification at 11:47, the animation of the rising arrow. He told it straight, without justification, and somewhere in the middle of telling it he understood, clearly in a way he hadn't at midnight, exactly what he'd done and why. Renato listened without interrupting. When Lucas finished, his father said, "I did something similar when I was 29. It was a different era, different instruments, but the mechanics were the same. Someone mentioned they'd made money. I felt left behind. I moved fast because I was afraid of missing something. I lost about 30%. Did you sell immediately?" "No. I held it for 8 months because I kept waiting for it to come back. And when it finally came back, I sold it the day it broke, even because I was so relieved I couldn't think straight. I didn't make anything. I just got back to zero, but I lost 8 months of that capital doing nothing useful." Lucas pressed the phone against his ear and stared at the wall. "The problem wasn't the investment," his father continued. "The problem was the reason I made it. I wasn't investing. I was reacting. You understand the difference?" He understood. He didn't sell the stock that night. He made himself a rule. He wouldn't look at it for 2 weeks. He wrote this on a small piece of paper and stuck it to the edge of his monitor, where he'd see it every time he was tempted to check. 2 weeks. He didn't have to fix it right now. He just had to stop reacting. Instead, he used the time to do the thing he should have done before buying anything. He started actually learning. Not the frantic late-night learning of a person trying to justify a decision they'd already made. Slow, deliberate learning. He found a book his father mentioned, a basic personal finance guide, nothing complicated, and he read it in pieces over several days. He made notes in the margins of a small notebook he kept by the bed. He wasn't trying to become an expert. He was trying to understand the vocabulary, the logic, the distinction between speculation and investment. What he learned first was also what surprised him most. The biggest obstacle for someone his age wasn't access to investments or lack of capital. It was the absence of a foundation. You couldn't build a meaningful investment strategy if you didn't first know where your money was going. You couldn't choose between a high-yield savings account and a stock portfolio if you didn't know your actual monthly expenses, your fixed obligations, your variable spending, your capacity to absorb a loss. The investment decision wasn't the beginning. It was somewhere in the middle, and he'd been trying to start from the middle. He opened a spreadsheet, a simple one, nothing fancy, no color coding, no automated formulas, just a list. Income at the top, fixed expenses below that, rent, utilities, phone, streaming subscriptions, then variable expenses, estimated, groceries, transportation, eating out, personal care, then what was left. The exercise took him 40 minutes and revealed something uncomfortable. He was spending about $340 a month on things he couldn't precisely account for. Not on anything specific, just friction spending. The coffee that wasn't quite a habit but happened more often than he realized. The delivery apps he used when he was tired. The random purchases made at low moments during the week. The subscriptions he'd forgotten to cancel and hadn't noticed because each one was small enough to disappear in the monthly total. $340. Over 12 months, that was $4,080, more than he currently had saved. He sat with that number for a long time. He sold the stock after 3 weeks, not 2. By then it had partially recovered. He lost $31 total, which he chose to see as an inexpensive lesson rather than a failure. He didn't reinvest the money immediately. He moved it back to his savings account and let it sit there while he thought. The temptation to move fast was still present. It didn't disappear after one honest conversation with his father, or one spreadsheet or one book. It was structural, built into every app designed to make trading feel like a game, every forum where people posted their wins and rarely their losses, every social interaction where money and success were mentioned casually as if competence were contagious, and all you had to do was stand close enough to it. He had a name for the feeling now. His father had given it to him in a follow-up conversation. FOMO investing. Fear of missing out. The idea that somewhere right now money was being made, and if you weren't participating, you were falling behind. It was the same feeling that had kept him awake at midnight with 3 tabs open. It was the same feeling that had made Daniel's offhand comment about returns burrow into his brain and stay there for days. But naming it helped. When the feeling came, and it came regularly in the form of notifications, headlines, casual comments, targeted content, he could identify it before it became a decision. He could pause. He could ask himself the question his father had given him. Am I investing or am I reacting? He started building the foundation he'd been missing. The emergency fund came first. He'd read about it in the book, and it had seemed obvious but abstract. A fund covering 3 to 6 months of essential expenses, held somewhere accessible, untouched unless genuinely necessary. He calculated what 3 months of his essential expenses looked like. It was $4,200. He didn't have that. He had $1,370 after the stock episode. So he set a goal, reach $4,200 before investing anything else. Not because the rule was sacred, but because he understood now what the rule was protecting against. An emergency fund wasn't about the emergency. It was about not being forced to sell an investment at the wrong time because something unexpected happened and you had nowhere else to turn. He knew people who'd liquidated investments at a loss to cover car repairs. He didn't want to be that person. The months that followed were quieter than he'd expected. He'd imagined that getting his finances in order would feel dramatic. A montage of discipline and willpower, visible progress marked with clean milestones. What it actually felt like was smaller than that. He cooked at home more often, not because he'd made a solemn vow, but because he'd seen the number and decided he wanted to know where his money was going. He canceled 2 subscriptions he genuinely didn't use. He started keeping a small notebook, physical, not an app, where he logged significant purchases for a week just to build awareness. None of it was revolutionary. All of it was real. By month 4, he had $3,100 saved. By month 6, he crossed $4,000. He was close to the emergency fund threshold, and something in his chest had begun to feel different. Not secure exactly, but less precarious. The hum of low-level anxiety that had been his financial background noise for years had quieted slightly. Not gone, but lower. He also spent 6 months watching rather than doing, at least in terms of investing. He followed a few index funds. He read about the history of markets, not to predict them, but to understand their nature. He learned that the most reliable gains in the stock market over long periods came from time in the market, not timing the market. That a 24-year-old with 30 to 40 years before retirement had something no sophisticated adult investor could buy. Time. That compound growth was less a financial trick and more a mathematical fact, and it rewarded patience over cleverness. He learned what a low-cost index fund actually was. He learned the difference between a brokerage account and a retirement account. He learned what expense ratios were and why they mattered over time. He didn't learn all of this at once, and he didn't learn it perfectly. but he learned enough to feel like he was building a vocabulary in a language he'd been trying to speak before he knew the alphabet. His father drove up to visit in October. They sat on Lucas's small balcony on a Saturday afternoon with coffee and the remnants of a late lunch, the city making its ordinary Saturday sounds below them. The conversation moved through family news, work, the documentary series his father had finished and was already nostalgic for. At some point, Renato asked him how things were going with his finances. Lucas told him about the emergency fund, how close he was, how it felt. He told him about the spreadsheet, the notebook, the canceled subscriptions, the slow accumulation of clarity. He told him about the book and the things he'd understood from it that had surprised him. He told him he was almost ready to start investing again, but this time with a plan. Not a perfect plan. A starting plan. An honest one. His father listened with the same patient quiet he'd offered on the phone call months earlier. "There's one more thing I want you to know," Renato said when Lucas had finished. "Something I didn't understand at your age and spent years learning the hard way." Lucas waited. "The goal of investing at your stage isn't to get rich. It's to build a habit. The amounts you're starting with are small. The returns will be small for a long time. That's not a problem. That's the design. The point is that you're practicing. You're building the mental framework, the discipline, the patience, the tolerance for uncertainty. By the time you have real capital to invest, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, you'll have already made most of your beginner mistakes. You'll have already learned not to react at midnight. You'll have already built the habit of thinking long. That's the actual compound interest that matters most at your age. Not the money, the mind." Lucas looked out at the city for a moment. He thought about the night he'd bought the stock. The glow of the phone in the dark room, the animation of the rising arrow, the hollow feeling of waiting to feel like an investor and not quite finding it. He thought about the $31 he'd lost, about the spreadsheet and the $340 mystery, and the $4,000 quietly accumulating in an account he was no longer tempted to raid for something that felt urgent. He thought about his father eating alone in the kitchen after everyone was in bed, carrying the weight of money trouble in silence because that was what you did with hard things. He didn't want to do it that way. In November, he made his first deliberate investment. Not impulsive, not reactive, not late at night with forums open and a notification pushing him forward. He moved $200 into a broad market index fund. Low cost, diversified, boring in the way that turned out to matter. He'd chosen it after reading, comparing, and asking questions. He'd done it in the morning with his coffee with a clear head. He set up an automatic monthly contribution. Not a large amount, he was realistic about what he could sustain without pressure. But consistent. The kind of consistency that didn't require willpower because it was automated, invisible, already accounted for in his monthly budget. He didn't check the balance for 3 weeks. When he did, it had moved slightly, barely, meaninglessly in the short term. He looked at it for a moment, nodded once to himself and closed the app. There was no animation, no rising arrow, just a number, sitting quietly, beginning its long work. He thought of something he'd written in the notebook months ago, a line he'd come across in the book and circled twice. The best time to start was before you were ready. The second best time was now. He hadn't been ready at midnight in August. He'd been afraid and impatient and hungry for a shortcut. He'd been 24 and behind and certain that the gap could be closed with the right move at the right moment. He was still 24. He was still behind by some measures. But the gap he was most focused on now wasn't between him and some imagined version of financial arrival. It was between who he'd been on that Sunday night. Reactive, rushed, looking for the feeling of doing something without the discipline of knowing why, and who he was becoming. Someone who moved slowly enough to think, carefully enough to plan, and patiently enough to let time do the work that urgency never could. He closed the laptop. Outside, November was doing what November did, shortening the days, cooling the air, asking everyone to slow down a little and take stock of what they'd built before the year ran out. Lucas walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and started thinking about next month. Not anxiously, not with the hum, just planning, just forward. The quiet kind of forward that doesn't make noise but doesn't stop either.